And it's my pleasure to be the one that introduces your moderator to this session on off-ramps, rehabilitation, and reintegration of veterans, a continuation of the veterans and law enforcement track. George Salim is in competition and likely to win the Summit Workhorse Award, both as a moderator and as a panelist. You've seen him so many times, I'm not even going to bother to introduce him, except to say two things. One is that he's a senior vice president for national affairs at the Anti-Defamation League. And the other is to say to you what I said to George yesterday. I'm so impressed by the Anti-Defamation League and their presence at this summit. George told me there are 12 people from the league here, and every one of them that I've seen is extremely impressive. And I'm so thankful for what ADL does and for what George does. George, welcome. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Thank you for being a fellow Browns fan. And thanks to you and all the other members of the executive committee for sponsoring and helping usher in this great event. So we're at kind of day 3, which means folks are focused on caffeine, which is important, and making sure that they have their last minute connects before everyone kind of heads in their separate directions. But this panel is a really critical conversation. We've had some great conversation amongst us in the lead up to today. And so what I want to do is kind of 2 or 3 things just to kind of set the stage. First, I'm going to just recap the summary here, and I will ground it in terms of some of the key questions that we went over in the prep leading up to today. I'll open up the panel for them to kind of give a quick bio sketch and kind of state their kind of upfront response to the question we're being asked to take on. And then we'll facilitate a couple kind of questions throughout the panel. And at some point in the panel, I want to encourage folks to, think about questions. I'll try to pause, 10 or 15 minutes before we get to the conclusion of time, and I'll just kind of ask you all in the audience and online, think about your questions. If folks in the room have something, raise your hand, and we'll keep the conversation very interactive. That's a good start. So panelists, good morning. Thank you all for being here today. Let's just set the scene real quick for this track and why this conversation is so important. Off-ramps, rehabilitation, and the reintegration of veterans. So over the course of the past 2 days, we really set the scene with the state of affairs on these issues. And now as we start to get a little bit deeper into some of the solutions and assessments of the problem, let me kind of frame the question in front of us. While there are organizations that specialize in helping individuals disengage from violent extremist networks, none of them currently focuses on individuals with military service backgrounds. Further, while veteran service organizations can and do help veterans address their challenges, there is no formal programs within the veteran service organization structure to serve as peer mentors for individuals exiting extremism. What can we learn from organizations that focus on off-ramping, and is there an opportunity to leverage them to support veterans specifically? So the real core issue we're focusing on here is the off-ramping. Lessons learned, and ultimately, the nugget we want to take away here is not just the lessons learned, but where are there opportunities to scale? Where are there opportunities to partner? Where are there opportunities to add a little bit of connection, financing, funding, connectivity to make something that demonstrates itself as a best practice, get bigger, faster, quicker, and be able to ultimately serve more people for this really interesting problem set. And so here's a kind of a quick rundown of what I'd like to do. I'm going to start with Chris and kind of come down the panel. I'm going to ask everyone to just do like a brief bio sketch of themselves, introduce themselves, their organization, brief bio sketch, and then we'll get into really the thesis as to why we're all here. And I think starting with Chris and understanding his background and how he approaches this issue really helps set the stage for a very robust conversation. Chris, over to you.
Thank you. Chris Buckley, I work with Parents for Peace. I am a combat veteran of Afghanistan and also a former extremist myself. Is that quick enough?
Perfect. Emma.
I am Emma. I am the program director at Parents for Peace. I work with Chris, Miriam, and a lot of people on my team on developing the methodology behind the work that we do. and developing the different programs, including our trauma recovery program, which is aimed at veterans and law enforcement.
Great.
Yeah, I'm Chuck Leek. I am an exit specialist, peer mentor with Life After Hate. I am a U.S. Navy veteran. I was involved with white supremacist organizations while I was in the Navy. I was investigated by the NCIS, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later.
Great.
My name is Sarah Budge. I'm the Exit USA Program Director at Life After Hate. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I'm also a graduate instructor in the START program.
Great. Chris, can I turn back to you? There's a lot of involvement in Eradicate Hate this year from both Life After Hate as well as Parents for Peace, two organizations that I think are really doing groundbreaking work in many ways, especially on the ways that we kind of address them here. In terms of kind of best practices, you and Chuck have a unique vantage point from not just everyone else on this panel, but everyone else at this conference. Can you share a little bit about just a minute or two on the story with your story for coming off of active duty, and a little bit about how an off-ramp or a best practice could be relevant to someone like you who's coming off active duty today?
Saying what best practices or what off-ramp would be good would kind of imply that there was one. I think that I'm going to take this opportunity to call the VA out again and just tell them that they have an opportunity to do the right thing and get involved with mental health, because it's kind of like not available. When I come out of the military, there's a lot of things that I just wasn't expecting. You go through this lifestyle of like, you have your comrades, you have your job, you have your paycheck, you have your insurance, you can go to the doctor, all that ends, right? So you come home and you start to experience the mental health issues because you're alone, you don't have your comrades, substance abuse is a big deal to cope. And eventually you just, for me, I'm not going to say people that come off the military have this problem constantly, but it's very common that they spiral, catastrophize, and then kind of just hit this place where bad things happen that weren't supposed to.
Chuck? A little bit about your kind of story coming off of military service and what an off-ramp could have meant for you or the you of today.
Yeah, okay. So my experience was significantly different than Chris's. I was active duty when I radicalized, and I got charged with a civilian felony, and when I was convicted of that felony, the military released me. In between those time periods, NCIS did an investigation of me and a couple other people that were involved with the same group that were also military. And
how do you spell your last name?
Sorry, that was a little distracting.
Anyway, not directed to you.
So NCIS did an investigation. There was no, like, they didn't. Okay, I thought they basically poo-pooed it and said, don't recruit on base.
That was it.
And yeah, so there was really no opportunity for off-ramping for me, because I went, basically, not quite, but almost directly from military service into the California penal system. So,
great. I want to kind of draw out two other key themes here. The first theme I want to draw, Emma, I want to ask you to kind of touch on this concept of reintegration from active duty service to civilian life. And then I really want to understand and have the audience understand the clinical aspect of what off-ramping and reintegration is from the concepts that you helpfully informed us on of primary, secondary, and tertiary. So Emma, if you can kind of start to just talk about this concept of reintegration, how Parents for Peace thinks about it, how you've kind of studied it, and then I want to get into some of the clinical definitions of it.
Of course. So something that we do see in general in kind of the theory of change when it comes to extremism is that people often fall into those groups or decide to join those groups because it either channels a certain sense of resentment and anger, and also provides a sense of belonging and purpose. And so very often what we do see is that people choose to join groups not because of the ideology itself, but because of what it does to them and what it provides in the sense of the community. And what we started noticing is that veterans can become a very vulnerable population to extremism because of that particular reason, because of the stories you'll hear about issues of the mob and the fact that the government isn't present, the VA doesn't provide the right services. And so the military culture is extremely bonding and is all based on like creating the sense of community in a certain sense and this like in-group and this group thinking. So living this and being met with just a sense of abandonment and rejection by the rest of society can be extremely isolating and lonely. And so this is where the grooming comes into play, be it active or passive grooming by the extremism, is it provides this sense, even if it's just an illusion, of community, of belonging, of purpose.
Great. Sarah, you have literally clinically studied these cases and cases like this across the country. Help us understand this concept of off-ramping, reintegration, rehabilitation, stepping back from the immediate kind of cases from our colleagues here on the panel. Clinically, as you kind of think about this concept at large, how do you even approach it for people that aren't in this business or in this space? You know, how do you start to describe it as someone who's trained in doing this work for lay people and people who are passionate about trying to help? How do we start to think about understanding it?
Right, thank you. So please let me know if I get too technical, because that is a problem that I have. I do think it's really important to be immersed in the body of literature that already exists on this topic in terms of radicalization, and really being clear about how complex this process is, of how people get in and why they stay in, and then eventually why some people exit. And there is a fairly strong body of evidence, and that is growing. And what we can say is it's really characterized by multifinality and equifinality, which are big fancy words I like, because I like big fancy words. But multifinality being that the same individual or a group of individuals with the same risk factors, the same adverse childhood experiences, for example, the same exposures to violent extremist narratives, will all end up in very different places. So if you take 10 people, all from the same starting point, maybe only one ends up in violent extremism. The other 9 end up in very different places. Could be in pro-social social networks and behaviors. Could be in alcohol and drug, with alcohol and drug issues. There's a variety of outcomes starting from the same place. And the other piece of this is equifinality, which is that we have a diverse set of starting points that all end in the same place, which is violent extremism. So not everyone starts with a grievance. Not everyone starts with seeking behavior. Not everyone starts in the same place, but what we find is there are these multiple pathways that end in the same adverse outcome, as I would say, which is violent extremism. So when we understand that complexity, we also then have to think about things like primary, secondary, and tertiary intervention. And that's a public health model that shows us that there are primary interventions, preventions that would be implemented with the entire population. So in this case, would be with the entire population of individuals in the military. And we would be looking for what are some of the common risk factors, even if they don't always end in violent extremism, that we could address. And those could be things much like the Mitchell Family Foundation's program, engaging ROTC cadets in predominantly white universities with historically black colleges, coming together and engaging and learning about each other and really developing those relationships. That would be one really great example of a primary prevention program. Secondary prevention would be identifying those people who might be at risk. And this is where, again, that body of literature we have on those risk and protective factors is really meaningful. We identify the people carefully without stigmatizing who might be at risk for going down this pathway to violent extremism, and we conduct interventions there. And those could be things like addressing pre-existing mental health conditions, pre-existing drug and alcohol conditions, pre-existing other vulnerabilities, There's also, frankly, a developmentally normal stage of seeking identity and belonging for many of the members of our military just based on their age. It's very typical development for someone in their late teens and early 20s to be seeking their identity. Who am I? What do I believe? And where do I belong? So that might also reflect an age group that might be more vulnerable potentially because they're in a natural seeking stage. So a secondary prevention program might address those things like identity and values and upholding the American values that we all hold so dear without racism, without violence, without extremism. Tertiary intervention is what do we do when the problem has already happened? And this means that we need to either stop the problem from getting worse, stop the radicalization from progressing to violence. So we catch those people who are already engaged in the ideology, maybe in the online behaviors, and we address that immediately to at least prevent it from escalating to violence, or in an ideal world, reversing that trajectory, mitigating those effects, and the dirty words of disengagement and de-radicalization, actually disengaging people from the beliefs and from the behavior and the social networks, helping them rebuild a valued identity and a belief system that is not compatible with violence.
Sarah, one quick follow-up before we leave this subject. You framed this model as a public health model of primary, secondary, and tertiary interventions. In your professional perspective, are the issues that we're talking about here at the summit writ large, eradicating hate, on this panel specifically, on the potential of an individual with extremist ideologies coming out of active duty, is in your perspective, is that public health model directly applicable to this problem set?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think, again, what I have heard here, and when I translate everything that I've heard in this summit, I hear, these primary interventions that people are putting into place. I hear these secondary prevention programs, right. And I know that there are tertiary intervention programs represented here on the stage.
Perfect. One of the things that came up in the prep call for this panel, thank you for that. Chris, you had mentioned, as we were getting to know each other, we were thinking about this, you had mentioned the importance, now that we've kind of have this concept that there is a possibility to apply a model of kind of off-ramping or reintegration, you had mentioned the need that was so important to destigmatize conversations around extremism in the military. And you kind of led off with the fact by saying, hey, like, I think the VA could do a better job on this. And so I wonder, from your firsthand perspective, tell us a little bit about why this conversation needs to be destigmatized, your own experience of it, and how we collectively, as a group of kind of concerned people here, how we can collectively take the stigma or like the ethos of we can't really talk about that here, or that's not in my unit or not in my branch of service. How do we take away the concept that we can't talk about this within the ranks?
So I think the first thing that needs to happen is we need to understand that these are very human experiences, right? And you can't policy out a human experience and a reaction to a behavior, right? So to put into context, if I had a lit cigarette and I jabbed Emma in the arm with it, I can't tell her, you're not allowed to make a noise, right? That's against policy because it's a human response to a trauma or an action that happens in your life. And I think that when we blanket approach this by the military and be like, it's not allowed in my Army, it's not allowed in my Corps, it's not allowed in my Navy or on my ship, then you become like inacknowledgeable. Like, it's like, I'm just not going to identify it until I identify it. So I think there's a need to be proactive rather than reactive. We need to educate our support staff. Our chaplaincy has a very great role to play in this process. Chaplains do a lot of great things, and I think that this is really in their wheelhouse to kind of get involved with extremism and ideology, counter the narrative. Chaplains don't have to just be for religious services, right? And then on another different track to that is like, we need to make it to where our soldiers aren't afraid to come and ask for help. Like, hey, can we talk, blah, 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 shut the door. A lot of commanders have an open door policy, but they also have an obligation to, when you bring this to me, like I have to say something. So, I mean, there's a way to handle it and not stigmatize the fear, one, of self-reporting or having somebody report on you, and two, being able to provide the appropriate health and wellness to the soldiers, both mentally and physically, when the problem does start to present, right? So it's just like a disease model. It's progressive, unless arrested, can become fatal. And it doesn't have to be fatal for the person, but it can cause fatalities, right? Because we know that one soldier suffering with a rifle can do a lot of damage. So I just think that everybody has a seat at that table, and when commanders are like, oh, I'm just going to policy it out. Just going to policy that general that's up there that's like, well, we just won't allow it. We'll policy it out. There's policies against drugs
Those
too.
are just words on paper.
And there's policies against, like, you know, you're not allowed to kill yourself, and we have 22 a day, right? So them 22 suicides that we're so graciously going to remember here and say that, you know, we want to prevent those. We also want to prevent the next extremist veteran.
Yeah, great point. So, Chuck, can I bring you into this theme of destigmatizing the conversation? I mean, how you think about it today, having kind of studied this, having a lived experience in it, what are the taboos? Like, if someone's coming off active duty today, if you're talking to, you know, a young man or a young woman who's kind of coming off active duty, and you know, you see certain indicators that, you know, resonate with you, you know, is this persona non grata to talk about? And if it is, how do you kind of take away hey, like, it's okay to talk about it? There are organizations who work on this. How do we destigmatize this from your perspective?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, it's not just, you know, Life After Hate or Parents for Peace. I think this needs to be a complete and holistic conversation and acknowledgement that the military really needs to embrace. You know, like, you know, Lloyd Austin a year or two ago said they acknowledged that there was a problem and said that they're going to do something about it. But so far, I haven't really seen that anything is being done further than making that acknowledgement. So, and just briefly, so I spoke about the NCIS investigation that I was subject to. This was in 1987, 1988. And as I said, the results of that investigation were basically nothing was done. Nothing punitive, no repercussions whatsoever for being actively involved in the White Aryan Resistance, Tom Metzger's group. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because in 2015, Brandon Russell, who formed Atomwaffen Division, was investigated by his command after there were 2 murders committed in his apartment. Wow. They found, a framed picture of Timothy McVeigh in his room, Mein Kampf, multiple pieces of Nazi paraphernalia, and explosives. And the determination of that investigation was that no reasonable person would suspect that he was involved in a white supremacist group, which is just mind-boggling. But I'm pointing that out because from 1988, 2 years after they, you know, recoded the UCMJ to make, you know, extremism basically illegal under the UCMJ, although there was nothing punitive happened. You know, almost 30 years later, 2015, the exact same result, essentially. So the military really needs to acknowledge this problem and embrace taking a holistic approach because, frankly, tertiary intervention is absolutely necessary. The VA really does need to engage with tertiary programs to help people that are coming out and to destigmatize that conversation.
Yep.
But that destigmatization needs to begin from boot camp and continue. You know, we could have, like, you know, peer mentors amongst military groups who are trained to recognize signs and symptoms, who can counsel people while they're in. So that this is an ongoing thing throughout, like, put the same care into, you know, what a soldier's life is going to look like after they're in the military, and keeping them from becoming radicalized in the military, because frankly, the process that we use to train soldiers to be able to kill other people is a radicalizing factor. I mean, you know, it
I like your framing. You said signs and symptoms.
Yeah. And so if people are trained while they're in the military, and there are people that they can talk to while they're in the military, about, hey, I'm beginning to have a problem with this. And that would be immensely helpful. And then continue that conversation, and as they're being discharged, as they're going through their. Chris, it's been a long time. What is it?
It's your ETSing.
ETS, yeah,
Ending in
your
service.
exit basically. As you're going through that, there should be some reviews, some evaluation of where someone stands on extremist viewpoints.
Pause on that for 1 second.
Sure.
That's exactly the tip off to the next question.
Okay.
There should be.
Yes.
So Emma and Sarah, let me bring you into the conversation here. The focus here is what can we learn, and how, if at all, can military service branches or the DoD writ large leverage organizations that are in this space? So Chuck set it up perfectly here. So Emma, let me kind of start with you in terms of off-ramping, reintegration. You have firsthand knowledge with one or more organizations that has done this work. What are 2 or 3 kind of bite-sized nuggets to share with the audience here that you can share in terms of the best practices that you've observed at Parents for Peace that is relevant to potentially apply at a much bigger scale?
I think the first difference that I want to point out is that very often we work with people that come voluntarily to us. And I think that's going to be one of the big barriers and hurdles that we have to deal with within this field and within this work, is that we need to go upstream. If we want it to work, just like Chuck, Chris, Sarah have been saying, especially amongst the military and service members, it doesn't start when they become veterans. It starts before. So we need to be able to develop those communities and this type of work before they become veterans. And I think yesterday I was part of this great conversation with all those VSOs, like talking about what they want to do and their availability, but the fact that often there's no information sharing between the government and between all those organizations that are providing the services. They are filling this gap that is often filled by those extremist groomers, but they don't have access to the data on who is going to come out of active duty, who's going to be part of that potentially vulnerable population. But those organizations exist. They don't necessarily have the right platform or enough access to the right information in order to be able to do the right work.
Great. Sarah, Exit USA, Life After Hate, give us 2 or 3 of the really key kind of best practices that you've observed on those organizations or in the space writ large.
So in Exit USA, we have a multidisciplinary team, and we work both with the radicalized individual. We also work with family members. And in the case of veterans, in which we do have a veterans population that we serve, it can be the spouse or the partner, it can be the parents, even though these are adults, the parents are often still involved in their lives. Sometimes it's adult siblings that reach out to us. So what we need is this multidisciplinary team approach, and that core team needs to include social workers, psychologists, and peer mentors, and they all need to be competently able to assess risk. And the reason that I highlight this is that, as Chris very articulately pointed out, the high numbers of suicides that we are seeing among veterans. Notably, we recently conducted a chart review over the last 2 years of the exiting individuals, the people who have self-referred for support services in exiting violent extremist movements. Nearly 50% reported suicide ideation at intake in writing. And that's just the number of people who were willing to disclose that right out of the gate. And even as I was coding this data, I recognized people who we later found out were experiencing suicidal ideation, which of course is a risk for acting violently. And so we need people who first and foremost have that capacity. Second of all, we need those services and interventions to be individualized. There is not going to be a cookie cutter program that will work for every family member, for every exiting individual, as we call them. We need to be able to assess those complex needs and the barriers to exiting violent extremism. And then we need to establish a baseline for their involvement and then be able to track progress over time. And those are just best practices from complementary fields such as social work, psychology, and medicine. We need to be able to see what we would call a response to intervention. And so there needs to be that assessment and tracking over time. Really, ultimately, what we need is this multidisciplinary team, a core multidisciplinary team, that then reaches out to these VSOs, these other NGOs, these other groups groups, and we build and wrap around this individual all of the services and the new social network that they are going to need to both exit and successfully stay out and reintegrate into society.
Perfect. Let me kind of turn to the studio audience here and say that the audience, not the studio.
That was an applause line.
I know. I feel like I'm a game show host today. Let me turn to the audience and just say, I know. I've got kind of one or two themes I want to continue to kind of elicit from the panel. So if you all have some questions, start to think about them. I'm going to kind of come back to you in the room here in just a moment. But Emma, you made such an important point earlier about the fact that individuals who kind of put themselves forward have to do so in a voluntary way. This can't be compulsory. That is such an important theme. Let me start with Chris and Chuck on that theme and just say, talk to us about, from your perspective, the availability, the mental availability for an individual who has a predisposition to an extremist ideology to say, you know what, maybe I should talk to somebody. You know, Chris, you rightfully made the point, commanders allegedly have an open door policy. Maybe that works, maybe it doesn't, but talk to us a little bit about your thoughts of the voluntary nature on this. Should there be, Chuck, you kind of elicited in the kind of exiting active duty process, maybe there should be some type of mandatory check. So let's spend a minute talking about this concept of where should it be, from your perspective, voluntary, what should be mandatory. Share a couple thoughts on that topic with us.
So I think that the way to mitigate that is going to be quite simply reframing, right? When we look at extremism and we really peel back the layers, we come across some pretty significant things that are usually involved across all ideologies, all types of groups, extremists, like whatever they are, Islamist, eco-terrorism, white supremacist. And one of the key things that me and Emma have seen, and I'm sure Sarah and Chuck have seen in their work, is trauma, whether emotional, mental, or physical, which we know the military is full of trauma, right? The second thing is the substance abuse factors and the mental health, right? So the mental health blankets into like PTSD, suicide. So when we create a program like we did at Parents for Peace called a trauma recovery program, when you ask somebody, be like, are you having extremist ideology? No. Well, that's kind of a taboo in itself, right? We don't talk about that. Hey, are you doing okay? Like, that was some pretty heavy stuff, man. Like, are you okay? Like, let's talk. So when you frame it that way and people are just talking about their stuff, and you create this program to kind of guide them through that and navigate it.
They don't feel targeted.
They don't feel targeted. And you can train the commanders. You can train the support and readiness staff. You can train the chaplaincy and the family members. We've actually created a support program for TRP for family members to support their veterans, because the veteran population, not humanly, but the way that they interact with the world is significantly different than any other population on the planet.
Yeah.
Right? So
Such
when
an
you
important
create that so that they don't feel the stigma and the target, then you get a 100% success rate. And it's not for every soldier, because not every soldier becomes an extremist. And I really want to emphasize on that. We talk about extremism in the military, and it does demonize the entire military by proxy.
Yeah.
Like, you know, I'm sure, like, I see Bill Braniff out there, and I love the dude, what he's doing at We the Veterans. And like, one of the things that we notice is when we can mitigate that like everybody's an extremist, we can kind of unanimously agree that everybody has trauma.
Yeah.
Everybody can talk about that, but not everybody becomes an extremist. And we can find the one that is susceptible to it, then we've done our job, right? Give them the tools they need, let them use it when they need them. If they don't, they don't. You know, I'd rather need it and have it than to need it and not have it.
Chuck, this concept of mandatory, voluntary training of the larger kind of space, whether it's, you know, your NCOs, your officers, your commanders, et cetera. Tell us a little bit about how you approach this concept of service members coming forward voluntarily, having it be built in as part of the process in some type of mandatory fashion. What's your kind of views on that?
Yeah, well, I think absolutely there's a role for a voluntary program, but that has to be well established and made readily available by the military.
Yeah.
But I also think that, just due to the nature of military service, the training that they receive, the fact that violent far-right extremist groups actively recruit and actually actively infiltrate the military, send people intentionally into the military to gain that training. I think the fact of those two things really means that there does need to be a mandatory requirement of at least a on exit from the military, a screening that can pick up the signs and signals, if nothing else, and then get these people referred, if so, to some kind of a tertiary intervention program.
Perfect.
And I think that's important because of the nature of the training and the nature of the far right's aggressive pursuit of military personnel.
Yeah, similar to the point that you made, Sarah, that there needs to be a multidisciplinary approach and it needs to be hyper-individualized. I think that's so important. I think, Chuck, you kind of touched on that theme a little bit.
George, could I say something about
Please.
mandated versus
Yeah.
self-referred? I think we can learn a lot from other complementary fields about mandated people who have been mandated to services versus those who are self-referred. It is a different approach. We do have supported interventions, empirically supported interventions like motivational interviewing that increase people's intrinsic motivation to change. And that comes out of the substance abuse field. And many people are mandated to treatment because of substance abuse issues. So we have these interventions that can be more successful, that can create that intrinsic motivation. But I also think that it's important to recognize that we would start in a different place with someone who is mandated to services, and we are taking some mandated clients now, and we start in a different place. When people come to us self-referred, they are often experiencing that disillusionment that we've seen throughout the body of literature, the disillusionment with either the social networks and violent extremism, some disillusionment with the ideology, burnout. We start with where they're at. When someone is not disillusioned, we are not starting with the violent extremism. We're starting in a different place. We're starting where they come. What about your life is working well? What about your life is not working well? And part of what motivational interviewing does is actually highlight there's probably a lot of parts of your life that aren't working well. So, for example, the mandated populations we're working with are coming out of federal prisons. And objectively, to most of us, their lives don't look great. And they will insist, no, this is wonderful, I feel great. Really? That's interesting, because you were just telling me how upset you were that your PO came in and searched your computer. But it's going great. Lifestyle's working well for you. So,
Just to clarify, is the motivational interviewing best applied in a voluntary capacity?
both, actually. It's very, very effective. Let's also recognize that even people who are self-referred are not necessarily intrinsically motivated to change everything. They often come because they're disillusioned with just the social networks and the behavior, but they have no intention of changing their beliefs. And so we have to recognize the levels of intrinsic motivation and lack of desire to change and address those even in a self-referred pop. But that, yes, motivational interviewing is used with people in particular who may be reticent to change.
Emma, did you have something you wanted to jump in on that theme?
Sorry. I think the work that we do at Parents for Peace also kind of adds to this in the sense that I was thinking about what I said, and what I realized is that we don't have many self-referrals. We have the families coming to us. The families are doing this on a voluntarily basis, but the actual individual of concern and the subject most of the time isn't willing to engage. So we're missing kind of a similar thing, but I think what I was trying to say earlier is that we have an additional factor that is the culture around it, and the fact that, again, just like the issue of extremism has also been politicized, there's an additional layer when it comes to the veterans population and the way the conversation around it is being framed, because not only are you trying to convince society, but you're trying to convince a population that is already feels rejected by society, that already on so many levels have had to suffer from homelessness, from a lack of access to healthcare, from a lack of access to mental health services, and a very high rate of suicide. And so when you add on that conversation about extremism, it feels like a lot, and it's a lot for a population to have to handle. And so I do really believe that my personal opinion from experience is that when I'm saying we need to go upstream is that we need to normalize the conversation around mental health and what it means and what it looks like, because one of the things that we see very often is like most cases are men, but men also are less likely than women to seek professional help when it comes to this. So how do you bridge this gap?
Sure.
And so there's many aspects to the conversation that need to be tackled.
You know, Emma makes a really interesting point. When you think about, when you step back and kind of zoom out 30,000 feet, and you think about the veterans population, on the one hand, some of the things that come to mind are high suicide rate, homelessness, access to care. Like these are real statistics within the veterans community. On the other hand, you go into any major airport in this country and the flight's getting ready to board. We'd like to call our active service members to the front to board first, please. Like there's a reverence for military service. You go on any job hiring website, we're actively hiring veterans. We're proud to show our support. Yellow ribbon on the trees in our front lawn. And in a way, there's a little bit of a disconnect there. On the one hand, the veterans community is stigmatized for the reasons that we kind of see problems within society emerge. On the other hand, there are elements of our culture that try to hold out the reverence for the veterans community. And so I think both of those issues are push and pull factors for a lot of what we see play out here. Let me kind of pause there. Let me kind of turn to folks here in the room. You can just raise your hand, jump in, ask a question. I'll help find a moderator frame, and we'll jump right into it. Ma'am.
I think your most recent point, having done some work with professional athletes, they experience a lot of the same things. They're brought on the field for recognition, but they have no money.
Yeah.
No health care, they have no jobs, they have, they come from broken situations. So I think as a society, we have to, it's lovely that they get to board first on the plane, but I think they trade that every day.
Totally.
For real help and real concern and real intervention. And I think we have to not take the bait on superficial honoring and support that we often engage in, and we turn a blind eye to the very real needs of our veterans, and that are hard and complex and layered.
Yeah.
And I think we do the same thing with professional athletes.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, jump in, Chuck.
Yeah, so that whole point, the reverence aspect that you're talking about is one of the things that makes the conversation about military extremism so hard, because it's seen as, in the general public's eye, it's seen as tarnishing the military, which is then tarnishing the country. And that we can, and that's the barrier to the conversation in a major way, and we have to be able to separate the fact that military members get into violent extremism from that is a stigma on the entire military, on the entire country. But then we also have to acknowledge that the reasons that these things exist are actually aspects of our entire country. It's aspects of the foundation and the things that we are fighting against and working to change right now, and the movement that needs to happen in our national psyche to really uphold and live up to the ideal of the American dream versus what has largely been the reality throughout our history, which are in direct contradiction to each other, in all honesty.
So true.
And if I can add on to that, I think the point of the sacredness of the American military is something that you need to tackle, but is very often in the issue of extremism and in this whole field, people are unwilling to lean into the discomfort of the conversations that are needed. And because the real question that we haven't even tackled here is the responsibility aspect. Like this veterans population, they've been trained by certain people. There's a culture around them that was created. All those people didn't just join one day. They came together and they were like, let's become this way and let's be trained this way and let's do this. There's people along the way, every step, that are responsible for certain ideas, for certain experiences, for lack of attention. And unless we're also willing to tackle the question of responsibility and what those people can do in order to change the world, in order to change that culture, is we're not going to go very far, because it's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone. You're only providing short-term solutions and an illusion of we're doing something here. But you need to go way into those layers and into that discomfort. I think the discomfort is so important. It's difficult, but it is true. We need to stop putting on pedestal people, and in a way, like talking about veterans as heroes dehumanizes them. And that's problematic, because the issue of extremism is so human.
Yeah.
One more thing to add, and it's kind of on the point of the statement that was made about the athletes going through the same thing as veterans. And, you know, it's easy to appreciate and virtue signal as a major corporation that, like, hey, we're going to let our veterans board first.
Yeah.
Hey, you get a 10% discount,
Yeah.
right?
Home Depot.
I don't need that shit when I'm in active duty and I'm in uniform. Like, when I was in the service,
Yeah.
I would purposely change my clothes and go off base in civilians. I didn't want remembered. I didn't want people to run up and shake my hand. That's not why I did it. Okay? I did it because it was a personal choice to defend my country and to stand up for the values that I believed in, like so many before me did. I didn't do it for a handshake. I didn't do it for a free small coffee.
Yeah.
Right? If you really want to help veterans, put them in a house. Put that drug-addicted veteran in rehab, right? There's so many great organizations out there, Wounded Warrior, We the Veterans, Tunnel to Towers, that are doing the ugly work,
Yeah.
right? Like, to me, when somebody's like, hey, man, you could probably get a military, I don't want it. Like, I don't want it. You know what I want? I want dental care
Yeah.
at the VA.
Yeah.
I want a competent VA medical center that doesn't just try to shove pills down my throat
Yeah.
and then shove other pills down my throat to cover up the side effects of the pills that they shoved down the first time. And like, it really aggravates me when people do that. It's like, oh, we're gonna let you on the plane first. Like, why? Because I'm in uniform?
Yeah.
Right? Like, we want our active duty military to board the plane first. What about a reservist?
Yeah.
What about a reservist? Can we call the reservist, like, hey, no questions asked, if you're a reservist, if you're a veteran, if you're, you know, like, get on the plane first. Hey, how about this, man? You're a veteran, you're going home, how much was your ticket? You don't have to pay.
Yeah.
Just get on the plane, man.
Yeah.
Right? Those kind of things, right? Like the virtue signal in this country by woke corporations to say, we support our veterans. No, you don't. No, you don't.
Let's spend a moment on this theme. Feel free to just raise your hand, and I'll make sure to flag it for folks. So, Sarah, if I may, let me start with you. We're gonna go off script a little bit here because you made such an important point. And so, this theme of what is actually needed, and the theme of this panel is kind of what have we learned and how can we apply it. So here's the hypothetical I'll throw out to the panel. So take a second to think about this. Sarah, if you'll indulge me, you kind of start with the question. So let's pretend we walk off this panel. And let's pretend outside of this room, the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, has been listening to this conversation. And you, Sarah, Chuck, Emma, Chris, you each get individually 1 minute to tell the Secretary of Defense what he should be doing, things he should take away from this conversation, and what we've learned and what you all individually have tried to apply, succeeded at, have been challenged at, failed at. What does the Secretary of Defense need to know about this conversation, about off-ramping, rehabilitation, and reintegration in the 1 minute you have to talk to him? Sarah.
It's been well said by everyone on this panel thus far, using different terms to say the same thing, which is we need a comprehensive approach. It needs to start upstream, primary prevention, whichever terminology we want to use. Start before the problem has happened, start recognizing the risk factors for when the problem is happening, and then addressing the problem when it has happened. And that it needs to have a multidisciplinary team involved in developing that approach. It needs to include people from the mental health sector, people from these NGOs, people from the medical sector, people from the veterans community, from your active duty, on the ground folks who know what it's actually like to live in the military today. And that team needs to come together and figure out where are all of the points of interdiction that we can create in the beginning, in the middle, and then when the problem has happened to reverse this.
Thank you. Chuck. You got 1 minute with Lloyd Austin. What are you
Yeah,
telling
so
him?
I would really, if I were speaking to Lloyd Austin right now, I would emphasize that the military.
He's not outside, by the way. Set the record straight.
No
But
pressure.
maybe he is watching. I hope he is. I would emphasize that the country writ large, but the military needs to address and acknowledge the fact that it historically has a white supremacy problem that. And I mean historically, like all the way back, that also since the civil rights era, it historically has a white supremacist problem in that most, if not all, of the modern contemporary leaders of white supremacy came out of the military. Many of them came out of Vietnam. They need to acknowledge that. They need to embrace that and address it as a problem and treat it seriously, because it is serious. Most of the modern white supremacist movement is getting its training in how it goes about killing people out of the U.S. military, at least in this country. So I would really emphasize, acknowledge it, address it, embrace it, and then begin to work at these primary, secondary, and tertiary interventions that will fix the problem.
Thanks. Emma, you got a minute. Secretary of Defense, what are you telling him he needs to know?
I think something that I've learned is that no one understands a veteran better than another veteran, and that needs to be a key aspect of any practices that we do and any initiative. And there's, as I was saying earlier, so many VSOs that existed already. And I always remember what Chris told me when, in the first times that I met him, where he told me most people think that the KKK recruits wearing, the hoods and the crosses. I was invited to a barbecue. And that's the gap that we need, that those veterans organizations can fill. It's like creating those civics engagement, this sense of agency, retrieving the sense of purpose, agency, creating different aspects. Could it be access to healthcare? Could it be access to politics? Understanding those different things. And we were working with an organization called Secure Families Initiative. They've been working with family members as well, of veterans. And they had this amazing initiative as well of really training people in civics and understanding civics, what they can do. There's programs now like Vet the Vote, of making sure that veterans can register as poll workers in order to be involved in the life of the country as well. There's so many different things that already exist. Make it easy for those organizations to be able to do the work that they can by giving them access to the data, but also the resources that they need in order to do it.
Perfect. Thank you, Emma. Chris, I know you would love 1 minute with the Secretary of Defense. So we walk out of
I'd
here.
love 5.
You only get 1.
We can have the whole conversation. So
You grab
Wait,
you grab coffee.
Did you just
2
5
chairs?
minutes alone, Lloyd Austin?
I'm calling you out, Lloyd. Call me. Look, so I think that I have 2 major things that I would love to emphasize to our Secretary of Defense. The first is, while I understand, and most veterans, most leadership, and most civilians will understand the very important necessity to, I'm going to use a bad buzzword here, radicalize our soldiers to be able to complete a mission, to be able to take the life of an enemy combatant and not carry that process that comes along with that, emotionally breaking down on the battlefield till a later point. Very necessary. We did it in the Revolutionary War, Civil War, Vietnam, Korea, World War I, II. Like it's a process that has to happen. Part of the task. With the response, with the responsibility of deprogramming that way of life. Very much a Lloyd Austin problem. Create the process to reintegrate our soldiers before we send them out into the community, and we have another veteran, led massacre or massive attack. The second thing, another Oklahoma City, another, JFK situation, right? Like another militia that pops up, right? So, and the second thing is our status as, important doesn't end when we leave service, right? Our government treats our veterans like a spoiled child treats his toys. That's broken. I need a new one, right? I look at the training that was put on me and how much it cost to train me to do the jobs that I did. I was a combat engineer. 13 years in the military. All them millions and millions of dollars, right? We're just gonna throw it away and get a new private, right? Like, we don't invest in fixing our toys. But as soon as there's something that they need to call us back, we'd be the first to go. And I think that needs to be honored. We didn't get the way we are now by not doing what we did before. And whatever that looks like, we didn't get our knees bad, our back broken, bad health care. We didn't get to be extremists. We didn't do that alone. There was help. And I just think that acknowledging that and making their mission, or at least an initiative to partner.
That is such an important point. In the remaining minutes we have left, Chris, thank you for setting that up. To try to leave on a little bit of an optimistic note, you know, there are resources, there are best practices. You all have kind of elicited a lot of the things that can be applied and scaled. One of the things we haven't talked about is the Novet Left Behind initiative. Sarah, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that initiative. Emma, please weigh in on it as well. There is a reason to be a little bit optimistic. There are tools and resources. You all have touched on many of them. Can you tell us a little bit about this initiative?
So the initiative is intended to address that tertiary intervention need, specifically with veterans. And so, of course, what I described in that multidisciplinary team, looking at the complex needs and barriers, trying to build that community of services and support around the individual as they are moving through that exit from violent extremism, exists at Life After Hate, and we're happy to partner on this initiative.
And where can folks find out information about it?
lifeafterhate.org.
Awesome. Emma? Novet Left Behind?
I think what's amazing about it is just the coalition of like different actors coming together and provide and thinking, brainstorming of ways to bring up everything we've brought up in this panel, of how can we appeal to the population without stigmatizing? How can we do this? And like all these people coming together in order to provide a potential solution or an alternative is fantastic. And I'm very excited to see it evolve and like become this great platform that people can eventually use.
Awesome. So there are opportunities, there are platforms, there are programs and initiatives. In conclusion, I want to thank my panelists for really sharing a lot of information, really substantive, both personal and professional insights. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. And as we wrap this panel up, you know, a lot of the initiatives and a lot of the organizations that are here, Exit USA, Life After Hate, Parents for Peace, and a host of others that are here, are really doing some incredible work. I'd ask that folks here in the room, as well as elsewhere at this event, please connect with a lot of the representatives of these organizations, figure out how you can connect with them, how you can find ways to engage with their initiatives. Thank you all.
Thank you, George.
Thank you.